Okay, Revelation chapter 2 in our inductive Centurion study called Apocalypse Soon. Chapters 2 and 3, that's the 7 letters to the 7 churches. These were real churches that existed during John's day. They were in an area known as Asia Minor. When he talks about the 7 churches that were in Asia, this is the area of the world we're talking about, modern-day Turkey. And you can see they're kind of on a little loop there. If you were to make a hike around or get on a camel and go from church to church, kind of make a big loop. And you see out there off to the far left, I've made a little circle where the island of Patmos was located. So that's where John is in exile as he's writing the Apocalypse. And you see how close it is, just a few miles off the coast of Asia Minor. They are very close to Ephesus and those other churches that you see. So chapter 2 is going to be about these 4 churches that are listed. And this is the part of the divine outline, the things that are. John was told to write the things that are. The things which you have seen, the vision of Christ in chapter 1, the things that are, this is going to be the 7 churches that existed, and the things that will happen after these things. So why were these 7 chosen, and why are they in this order? I mentioned to you that it could possibly be a view of an historical outline that tracks the history of the church age. There's plenty of other churches that were around that could have been chosen: Jerusalem, Antioch, Lystra, Iconium, Rome, and on and on. So why are these 4? So that's one of the questions that we want to grapple with here. So there's 4 possible, probably more than 4, but 4 possible applications of the letters that we'll look at here in this study. The first is specific, that these messages were specifically to these 7 actual churches. I think that's very true. I think the ramifications of that and application go far beyond that, but there certainly was a specific application to those 7 churches. They're admonitory in nature. Each message applies to every church to some degree or another. All churches will have elements of these 7 churches, and it's something that we need to be sensitive of in the modern church age. Personal, every one of the letters has what I call the ear phrase. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So if you have an ear, each message applies to you personally. We need to pay attention to all of the letters and what the message is that Jesus is sending to us. And then there's this prophetic application, potentially. It's controversial, but I'm going to share it with you so you'll see where it's coming from. It kind of holds some order, I think. In this order, they generally follow the history of the church throughout the church age. Daniel 9, when we get to that, you'll see that there's a gap in the 70-week prophecy. There's a gap between the 69th week when Messiah is cut off. So that ended at his crucifixion. And the 70th week, which is these are weeks of years, the 7-year period that precedes Jesus' return at the end of the Great Tribulation. So we're going to look at all that, how all that ties in to our study, and whether or not there is a prophetic application in the particular order that these 7 churches present themselves in. This may be the most important part of our overall study, because it applies to us. Each one of us needs to be heeding what the Spirit is saying to the churches. So let's look at some of the components. Every church got a surprise. That's kind of interesting. Each one of the 7 gets a surprise. Those that thought they were doing well weren't doing nearly as well as they thought, and those that thought they were doing well, thought they weren't doing well, were. So all churches got a surprise. There are 7 design elements in each of our 7 letters. What a surprise, right? This is our heptadic structure. There's 7 divisions, we could call it, of each one of the letters, and we'll see these. First of all, there's the name of the church. Obviously, it's addressed to that particular church, and there's a title of Christ. And every time Christ refers to himself in one of the letters, it's referencing back part of the vision of him that John had in chapter 1. It's back to that description that we dealt with in great detail back in chapter 1. There's a commendation to the church, although 2 of them have nothing good said about them. So 2 of them did not get a commendation. And then there's also a concern, although 2 of them have nothing bad said about them. So there's no concerns for two of them. So we'll look at those when we get there. There's an exhortation of such for each one of the churches, and there is a promise to the overcomer. Each letter gives us a different promise to the overcomer and a different clue as to who these individuals known as overcomers might be. We're going to look at that with some degree of intensity as we go through and conclude our study at the end of chapter 3 of these 7 letters to the 7 churches. We'll come to some conclusions, I think, about who these overcomers are, because that's been another debatable, controversial issue when it comes to the book of Revelation. And then the 7th design element is the ear phrase. You'll see this phrase in every one of the letters. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. It's plural. So if you have an ear, grab a mirror, see if you have an ear. I can look at my camera image here. I can see I still got mine. So we need to be hearing what the Spirit is saying to all 7 of the churches. So it's to each church, but each one of us who has an ear. So let's start with the first letter, the letter to the church at Ephesus. Let me just give you some historical and geographical background on the city of Ephesus. The name Ephesus means the desired one. It was founded, we think, in somewhere around 1400 BC. It was the site of a temple to a mother goddess. It was a fertility deity, later identified with the goddess Diana. We read about that in the book of Acts. It was captured by the Lydians in the 6th century BC. Croesus, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was their king. He was routed by the Persians under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great plays a critical role here because we saw him in Daniel chapter 10. And we looked at that vision of who I think probably was a pre-incarnate Christ, debatable, that appeared to Daniel chapter 10. Certainly had a lot of things in common with our description of Jesus in chapter 1 of Revelation, but it was conquered by Cyrus the Great. A key naval base during the Peloponnesian and Persian Wars. It fell to Alexander the Great. He was all over that area in 334 BC, sided with Antiochus of Syria against the Romans, became the Roman capital of the province of Asia. Remember, we're talking about Asia Minor here. It had its own municipal government, its own senate, known as the Queen of Asia. A prosperous city, very attractive. It was located near the mouth of the Cayster River. And it was a principal point of communication between Rome and the eastern provinces out in that area, and the eastern leg of the Roman Empire, known for a lot of outstanding architecture. Widespread occultic practices were there. And Paul had one of his major fiascos there. You may remember that with Demetrius the silversmith. In Acts chapter 19, he gets accused of some stuff, creates a big fiasco, and it's recorded there for us in the book of Acts. That happened in Ephesus. The site of the Temple of Diana, one of the 7 wonders of the world, was considered. And Timothy is thought to have been his first bishop there in Ephesus. John spent his closing years there after he got released from Patmos. After Domitian died, he gets released from Patmos, goes to Ephesus, retires there, probably set some things straight there in the church that needed to be taken care of. His gospel is thought to have been written from there. His tomb is thought to be there, and Mary is thought to have lived there, and where she is thought to have lived is a shrine, which makes sense because remember, John was told by Jesus, "This is your mother. You take care of her." So it may be that he moved her to Ephesus so that he could look after her there. And John's first epistle appears to be a letter to Ephesus. And this is interesting. Due to silting in the modern era, it used to be a big port city. It's now 6 miles from the sea. They got 6 miles worth of silt has built up in the last couple of thousand years. The prophetic profile, it may represent the apostolic church. This was the first church in our list, so the church would have started at Pentecost. We would have had what we call the apostolic age. Ephesus may represent that. They seem to be very focused on doctrine and purity of teaching, which was a hallmark of the apostolic church. You study that, see what you think. The name of the church and the title of Christ. Each letter begins with the title of Christ we mentioned based on his appearance in chapter 1. So this is how it starts. To the angel of the church in Ephesus write. The one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands, says this. So there's our description of Christ. You could think of this as the book of 2nd Ephesians, right? We have Paul's epistle to the Ephesians that we call Ephesians. And so in a sense, this is like the 2nd Ephesians, the second letter to the church at Ephesus, maybe even 3rd Ephesians, if you count 1 John. If 1 John is, in fact, a letter to the church at Ephesus, this could be the 3rd one in the series. The title of Jesus is found back in verses 13 to 16 of Revelation 1. And the commendation, that's what comes next in verse 2. I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men. And you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not. And you found them to be false. So he's commending them for getting rid of the false teachers, the purity of doctrine here. And you have perseverance, and you have endured for my name's sake, and have not grown weary. So that's their accommodation. Now, if you remember the book of Acts, Paul gives a final admonition to the elders at the Ephesian church, and he told them to guard against false teachings and to preserve sound doctrine. So it sounds like they heeded his advice. They followed his advice. Jesus is commending them for doing that very thing that Paul admonished them to do. Be on your guard for yourselves and for all your flock, and that which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, and not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore, be on the alert, remembering that night and day for a period of 3 years I did not cease to admonish each one with tears. So apparently they heeded Paul's advice, but there was a concern here. Jesus says, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. We can get so busy with the king's business, sometimes we forget about the king. There's a good illustration of this in Luke 10. Now, as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Mary. Remember the story of Mary and Martha, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary, for Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. The exhortation of Jesus, therefore remember from where you have fallen, and repent and do the deeds you did at first, or else I am coming to you, and get this, I will remove your lampstand out of its place unless you repent. Here's a good question for you. Where is the lampstand for the church of Ephesus today? It no longer exists. So apparently, the church at Ephesus heeded Paul's warning and did not heed Jesus' warning. And he took away their lampstand. Interesting. Yet this you do have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. There's some debate about who these people are. It's thought to be a first century sect. They claimed apostolic authority. Could have derived from Nicholas. He's one of the 7 that was chosen to have daily oversight. Maybe. There's some speculation about that. Here's the ear phrase. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And then the promise to the overcomer. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Now, we know about the, well, first of all, let's say this. The promise to the overcomer comes after the ear phrase. You can see right there in verse 7, the ear phrase is first. The promise to the overcomer comes second. That is consistently true in the first 3 letters, but it's flipped and reversed in the last 4 letters. And I have no idea why that is. If you come up with a reason why they may be a flipping in the order there and the structure of these letters, let me know, because that's a bit of a mystery. And then there's a clue for the overcomer. Who are these people referred to as the overcomers in each of the 7 letters? Well, we know they're going to eat from the tree of life. So that's one of the clues here. The tree of life was originally in the garden. Now, was it destroyed in the great flood? I tend to think that it was. Where is it now? We don't really know. Where will it be in the future? We do know the answer to that question. We need to look no further than the very book that we're studying. If we fast forward to Revelation 22, the last chapter in the book, then he showed me a river, the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And in the middle of the street, on each side of the river, was the tree of life. So it's going to be in heaven. That's where it'll be in the future. Maybe that's where it is now. bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Remember, God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden and put the cherubim there with the flaming sword so that they would not be able to get access to the tree of life. Because once they had fallen, that was off limits to them. Revelation 20, blessed are those who wash their robes so they have the right to the tree of life and may enter by the gates into the city. So we see a secondary clue here that washing your robes is a prerequisite for eating from the tree of life. So the overcomers apparently have clean robes. We see in Revelation 7 that one of the elders answered, saying to me, they are clothed in the white robes. Who are they, and where have they come from? And I said to him, my Lord, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation. We'll talk about what time period the great tribulation is later. And they washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So there's some speculation that the overcomers are the tribulation saints. And there's a lot of folks that feel that way. That's a possibility. And this verse here kind of ties into that. It may also be the possibility, though, or a possibility, that the tribulation saints, those that become Christians or are Christians during the tribulation period, are just a subset of the overcomers. That's kind of where I'm going to fall down as we continue our study here. But this is a good place for us to stop. We ended the letter to the church at Ephesus. We come back after the break. We'll pick up with the letter to the church at Smyrna in our Revelation study.